I thank you for the opportunity. It's been a while since I haven't been able to address Mexican foreign policy, and I think that this paper illuminates at least the context in which this country's foreign policy is being designed at this moment. I have, I think, 5 or 6 topics or aspects I would like to address, which deal with what Preciado has just presented and written before, but also tries to put in some, spices in this discussion. Mexican food is very spicy. So. The first one, it's interesting because to look at Mexican's foreign policy nowadays, but from a broader historical perspective, particularly in the moment in which the influence of globalization is so important for our emerging power foreign policies. Because in the case of Mexico, definitely Mexico was much more global in the contents of its foreign policy when the world was less global than today, when globalization has a much more important impact on our foreign policies in general. And I would allow myself to say that Mexican foreign policy has become much more provincial. So I think that there's a kind of an interesting comparison to be done between the process of the relationship of Mexico with the global world, or a globalization process, in the 70s, when Mexico was far ahead of all of us with the South-South agenda, with a third world agenda, and nowadays, South-South for Mexico is the relationship with Latin America. So the whole concept of the South has kind of diminished from a Mexican perception. So this would be a first comment I would make, and I would like to hear your reaction. The second one has to do with the relationship of Mexico with the region and with South America in particular. I know this might sound kind of dramatic, but why did Mexico leave us? That's the question I would make. Why? ¿Por qué nos dejó? Huh? That is the predominant feeling we have at this part of Latin America. Of course, the relationship and the border and the interests were stronger than the identity. I think that this puts very clearly probably a differentiation which could be helpful for the discussion of the previous part of this panel. But definitely, this has left a strong scars in the relationship from our perspective towards Mexico. So what I'm trying to say is that even though the Calderon administration has mentioned and has done some important or taken some important steps of a rapprochement with the region, it will take a time, if it can be overcome, the whole impact of what was built between Mexico and the U.S. from the early 90s on, and the impact that this buildup of bilateralism with the U.S. had on the relationship between Mexico and the rest of Latin America. I would go as far as to say that this has been one of the reasons and one of the motivations of the political construct of South America as a political actor in our days in the region, and of course of the protagonism Brazil has had in this process. So I think that, and definitely I think that this perception is not well built up and well present from a Mexican perception. I don't think Mexican academics in general and foreign policy community have the perception of this impact this process had upon the region in general, and from a Brazilian perspective, this is very present and very strong. And this leads me to another corollary comment, which has to do with the relationship and the pendant between Mexico and Brazil. And there's a moment in your paper in which you really mention not a rivalry with Brazil, but the idea that Brazil would have taken over the special relationship with the United States in the brokering of the relations with Latin America. I think that's a very interesting statement, because that is one of the perceptions that exists in the region. It's not the only perception, definitely, but one of the reasons why nowadays our neighbors and the neighbors of Brazil are suspicious of Brazil have to do with the perception that Brazil could be building up a special relationship with the United States in detriment of the build-up of a Latin American community, a genuine Latin American community. So I don't believe in that hypothesis, but I understand why it can be perceived. And I think that if we bring in the difficulties of Brazil with Mexico, this discussion can become even more interesting, though I'm not sure we can really deepen it today. The third topic has to do more with a question which probably could be deepened in the new version of the paper, which are what are the actors and the different actors in Mexico in this north-south alternative. I mean, and here I'll bring in the question of politicization, because and you don't go into the question of politicization, but it's behind your mind all the time. At least I saw it all the time regarding the different political options and the different ideological options in Mexico's foreign policy. Now, my question is: are these differences visible regarding the actors, regarding the business sectors? We're talking about the same business sectors involved in the U.S. and businesses with the U.S. and the U.S. border states that come to our region. I mean, bimbo. It's bimbo all over in the end. Or do we have some kind of differences which are also fighting for stronger support from the country, from the government? Also in Parliament. Now, we know the PRI is still very strong in the Parliament. PRI is very critical of Calderón's foreign policy. So how does politicization and actors play in the Mexico domestic life? And this leads me to the next comment, which has to do with the question of intermestic agenda. And I think it's a very interesting concept that has been brought up and built up because of the relationship between Mexico and the United States. And how does that play in your analysis? The concept that Mexico, besides a foreign policy agenda, has an intermestic agenda, particularly with the United States, but not only, because also with the southern border, the question of migration, the question of drug trafficking. I mean, those have become much more intermestic than international questions in the Mexico agenda. And my last comment has to do with what you mentioned before, which is the growing or the attempt to expand the South-South agenda. And here I would bring in that there are different ways to build up a South-South agenda. And one way I see going on in Mexico is not, I mean, I wouldn't say it would be the most virtuous South-South option, but it is a South-South option, which is the build-up of cooperation in security and in domestic security plans, agendas, and policies. And the cooperation you have between Mexico and Colombia in nowadays, the influence of Plan Colombia for Plan Mérida, all of that, at the end of the day, can be interpreted as a South-South agenda. But you have South-South agendas and South-South agendas. So I would leave it there.
Thank you, Monica.